May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Across the United States, church bells rang out in jubilant celebration while confetti rained down on crowded city streets. In prisoner of war camps, scattered from California to Maine, German soldiers prepared for their journey back to a defeated homeland that many no longer recognized. But in a small, hastily constructed facility outside Worcester, Massachusetts, something extraordinary was unfolding that would challenge everything these prisoners believed about their enemies and themselves. The dining hall of the Women's Auxiliary Camp fell into stunned silence as American kitchen staff placed metal trays before each of the 62 female German prisoners. On each tray sat an ear of golden corn, butter melting down its kernels, steam rising into the cool spring air. The women stared at their plates with expressions ranging from confusion to outrage to something approaching horror. Several pushed their trays away. Others looked around frantically, certain this must be some cruel joke or deliberate humiliation. 24-year-old Greta Hoffmann felt her stomach turn as she looked down at the corn. She had grown up on her family's farm outside Munich, where they raised pigs and dairy cattle. Every autumn of her childhood, she had helped her father haul cartloads of corn to the animal pens, watching the pigs root and squeal with delight at their feed. The idea that human beings would eat this food, would put it directly to their mouths, seemed fundamentally wrong, almost obscene. Beside her, Elsa Bergman, a former Wehrmacht nurse from Hamburg, actually pushed her chair back from the table. "They mock us," she whispered in German, her voice tight with anger and humiliation. "They show us what they think we are. Animals." Around the hall, similar murmurs rippled through the ranks of German women, their faces flushing with shame and rage. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell stood at the front of the hall, watching the scene unfold with growing concern. She had anticipated that the victory celebration meal might be difficult for the prisoners, but she had not expected this reaction. The corn had been chosen specifically because it was plentiful, delicious, and quintessentially American. She had wanted to share something good with these women, something that represented the abundance and generosity of her country. Instead, she was witnessing what appeared to be a profound cultural misunderstanding. Greta's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. In the 6 months since her capture in France, she had maintained her dignity through interrogations, through the uncertainty of imprisonment, through the gradual realization that Germany was losing the war. But this, somehow, felt like the final indignity. To be expected to eat pig food while American soldiers watched, as if this were normal, as if this were civilized. What none of the German women could have known in that moment was that this single ear of corn would become the beginning of everything that would transform their lives. 6 months earlier, on a gray November morning in 1944, 3 military transport trucks rolled through the gates of the newly established women's prisoner of war facility outside Worcester. The compound had been constructed hastily, converted from an old textile mill complex, with barbed wire fencing and wooden watchtowers added to transform it into something resembling a proper detention center. It was smaller than the massive camps housing male German prisoners, designed to accommodate fewer than 70 women. Greta Hoffmann climbed down from the first truck, her legs stiff from the long journey from the Boston port. She wore the remains of her gray auxiliary uniform, though the insignia had been removed weeks ago. In her coat pocket, she carried a single photograph, creased and worn from constant handling. It showed her family's farm, the white farmhouse with green shutters, her parents standing proudly before their fields. She had looked at that photograph every day since her capture, trying to remember what home felt like. The women who descended from the trucks ranged in age from 18 to 36. They had served the Wehrmacht in various capacities, roles that had seemed patriotic and necessary when they volunteered. Radio operators like Greta, nurses and medical assistants, administrative clerks, communications specialists, kitchen staff for officer messes, young women who believed they were serving their country's defense, now standing in an enemy land as prisoners. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell watched them arrive from the administration building steps. At 29 years old, she was one of only 3 female officers assigned to oversee this unusual facility. The army had struggled with what to do with female German prisoners, eventually deciding that women officers should supervise them. Sarah had requested this assignment, believing she could make a difference. Though now, watching these exhausted and frightened women file into formation, she wondered if she had been naive. The German women stood in perfect military lines despite their exhaustion. Their posture remained rigid, their faces carefully blank masks that revealed nothing of what they felt. Greta noticed how young some of them looked, girls really, barely out of school. She also noticed how they all maintained that same defensive dignity, refusing to show weakness before their captors. "Welcome to Camp Devon's Women's Facility," Lieutenant Mitchell said in careful, practiced German. She had been studying the language for 3 months, preparing for this assignment. "You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. You will be given adequate food, shelter, and medical care." Greta heard the words but barely registered them. She was thinking about the farm, about whether her parents had received her last letter before her capture. She was thinking about her younger brother Friedrich, serving somewhere on the Eastern Front. She was thinking about how the world had turned upside down, how she had gone from a proud member of the Women's Auxiliary Corps to a prisoner in a country she had been taught to view as barbaric and cruel. What surprised her most in that first moment was how ordinary everything looked. The American soldiers seemed no different from German soldiers, tired young men and women doing their duty. The buildings were plain and functional. Nothing matched the propaganda images of American savagery she had been shown. The first 2 weeks in the camp passed in a blur of tense routine and careful distance. The German women moved through their days like ghosts, speaking only to each other in hushed German conversations during mealtimes. They followed orders mechanically, their faces carefully composed masks of dignified resignation. When American guards addressed them, they responded with the minimum required: courtesy, nothing more. Greta found herself falling into the role of unofficial leader among the women. Her English was better than most, learned during her gymnasium years in Munich, and she possessed a natural authority that the others seemed to gravitate toward. She translated orders, mediated disputes among the prisoners, and maintained the military discipline that gave them all something familiar to hold on to in this strange land. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell watched these dynamics develop with growing frustration. She had hoped that treating the women with respect and dignity would open doors to communication, perhaps even friendship. Instead, she faced a wall of polite but absolute resistance. The German women accepted their rations, cleaned their barracks, attended roll call, and gave nothing of themselves in return. One cold afternoon in late November, Sarah attempted a different approach. She found Greta sitting alone in the compound yard, wrapped in a thin Wehrmacht-issued coat that provided little protection against the Massachusetts wind. The young German woman was staring at something in her hands, though she quickly tucked it away when Sarah approached. "May I sit?" Sarah asked in German, gesturing to the bench beside Greta. The prisoner nodded stiffly, her posture rigid. For several minutes, they sat in silence, their breath making small clouds in the frigid air. Sarah had learned that sometimes silence could accomplish what words could not. "You are cold," Sarah finally observed, noticing how Greta's hands trembled slightly. It was a statement, not a question, spoken in a tone that held genuine concern rather than official duty. "I am accustomed to cold," Greta replied in English, her accent thick but her grammar precise. Her voice carried the flat, emotionless quality of someone who had decided that revealing nothing was the safest path. Sarah unbuttoned her own jacket and removed the thick wool scarf her mother had sent from Vermont. "Here," she said, offering it to Greta. "Massachusetts winters are harsher than they first appear. You will need this." Greta looked at the scarf as if it might be a trap. Her eyes, gray as the November sky, met Sarah's with suspicion and confusion. "Why?" she asked simply. It was the first genuine question she had posed to any American since her arrival. "Because you are cold," Sarah answered, placing the scarf on the bench between them. "And because there is no regulation that says, I must let you freeze when I have the means to help." She stood to leave, sensing that pushing further would undo whatever small progress this gesture might create. Greta watched the American officer walk away, her mind struggling to reconcile this small kindness with everything she had been taught about the enemy. Americans were supposed to be cruel, violent, obsessed with material wealth, and devoid of honor. Yet this woman had just given away her own scarf without expecting anything in return. That night, in the cold barracks, Greta wrapped herself in the American scarf. It smelled of lavender soap and wood smoke, scents that reminded her achingly of home. Around her, the other women slept fitfully, some crying softly in their bunks. Greta lay awake, thinking about the lieutenant's eyes, how they had held genuine concern rather than the contempt or pity she had expected. It was a tiny crack in the wall she had built around herself, barely noticeable. But it was there. December arrived with a vengeance, bringing the kind of bitter cold that seemed to seep into bones and settle there permanently. The German women had no proper winter clothing beyond their Wehrmacht-issued coats, designed for European autumns rather than New England winters. The barracks, converted textile mill buildings with high ceilings and thin walls, offered little protection against the howling wind that swept across the compound each night. Greta woke one morning to find frost coating the inside of the windows, delicate patterns that would have been beautiful if they had not represented such miserable conditions. Around her, women huddled under thin blankets, some shivering so violently their bunks rattled. Elsa Bergman, in the bunk beside her, had developed a deep cough that rattled in her chest, a sound that reminded Greta of her grandmother's final winter. The American staff noticed. Private Tommy Walsh, a farm boy from Iowa, with kind eyes and freckles scattered across his round face, had been assigned to morning inspections of the barracks. When he saw Elsa struggling to catch her breath, her lips tinged blue with cold, something in his expression shifted from duty to genuine alarm. "Miss," he said, approaching her bunk cautiously, "you need to see the nurse." His German was terrible, just a few phrases learned from a pocket dictionary, but his concern transcended language barriers. Elsa looked at him with the same suspicion the German women had shown all Americans, but she was too exhausted to maintain her usual defensive posture. She simply nodded, allowing him to help her stand. As she rose, another violent coughing fit seized her, and she swayed dangerously. Tommy caught her elbow, steadying her with gentle hands. That afternoon, Tommy returned to the barracks carrying something wrapped in brown paper. He found Elsa resting after her visit to the camp medical station, where the nurse had diagnosed bronchitis and prescribed rest and warmth, two things in desperately short supply. Without asking permission, Tommy unwrapped the package and revealed a thick, hand-knitted scarf in shades of blue and cream, the wool soft and obviously well-made. "My grandmother," he said simply, pressing the scarf into Elsa's hands. "She makes them. For winter. You need." His broken German made several of the watching women smile despite themselves, the first genuine smiles that had crossed their faces in weeks. Elsa stared at the scarf, her fingers tracing the intricate cable pattern. In Hamburg, her own mother had knitted scarves just like this, spending long evenings by the fire with needles clicking rhythmically. The familiar texture brought tears to her eyes, tears she had successfully suppressed since her capture. "Danke," she whispered, the word barely audible. Word of Tommy's gesture spread through the compound. That evening, several other American guards appeared with extra blankets, thermos bottles of hot coffee, and even a small portable heater for the barracks. Sergeant David Chen, whose family had immigrated from China 2 generations earlier, brought a box of his mother's ginger tea, explaining through careful gestures that it helped with coughs and cold. Greta watched these small acts of kindness with growing confusion. The propaganda she had absorbed during her training had painted Americans as barbaric materialists, people without culture or compassion. Yet here were these young soldiers, many of them barely older than the prisoners themselves, sharing their own possessions and family treasures with enemy captives. That night, wrapped in Lieutenant Mitchell's scarf and watching Elsa sleep peacefully for the first time in days beneath Tommy's grandmother's handiwork, Greta allowed herself to consider a dangerous possibility. Perhaps everything she had been taught about the enemy was wrong. Early January brought a brief thaw to Massachusetts, a few days of relative warmth that felt like mercy after weeks of punishing cold. The camp kitchen staff, emboldened by improved weather and eager to celebrate small victories, decided to serve something special for dinner. They had received a shipment of late-season corn from a farm in Connecticut, sweet yellow ears that had been carefully stored in cold cellars. To the American cooks, corn on the cob represented comfort, abundance, and home. To the German women filing into the dining hall that evening, it represented something entirely different. Greta took her seat at the long wooden table, her metal tray clattering against the surface. She looked down and felt her entire body go rigid. There, steaming and glistening with melted butter, sat an ear of corn. The golden kernels seemed to mock her, each one a tiny reminder of the pigs squealing in their pens back home, of her father tossing feed into troughs, of the fundamental dividing line between human food and animal fodder. Around her, the reaction rippled through the hall like a wave. Some women simply stared in disbelief. Others pushed their trays away with visible disgust. Elsa, still weak from her recent illness, but recovering steadily, actually stood up from her chair, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. "They mock us," she said in German, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent hall. "They show us what they think we are. Animals." Greta's mind raced back to childhood memories. She was 7 years old again, following her father to the pig enclosure with a wheelbarrow full of corn stalks and ears. She remembered the pigs' eager grunts, the way they fought over the corn, how her father had laughed and said the pigs ate better than some people during the last war. The image of putting that same food into her own mouth filled her with shame so deep it felt physical. A young woman named Katrin Schultz, barely 19 years old and still homesick for her mother's kitchen in Berlin, began to cry. "I cannot," she whispered. "I cannot eat pig food. What has become of us?" Her tears triggered others. Soon, several women were weeping quietly, their shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell stood frozen at the front of the hall, finally understanding the catastrophic mistake they had made. She moved quickly between the tables, her mind working to salvage the situation. "Please," she said in German, her voice raised to Carrie. "Please, this is not mockery. In America, corn is food for people. Good food, special food." Greta found her voice, speaking as the unofficial representative. Her English came out clipped and cold. "In Germany, Lieutenant, we feed corn to pigs and cattle. It is animal feed. You ask us to eat as animals eat." Corporal James Martinez, the head cook, stepped forward with anguish written across his face. "Ma'am, we didn't know. In my family, in Texas, corn is what we eat at every celebration. It's special." The dining hall remained tense, two groups separated by an ear of corn. By cultural assumptions, neither had thought to question. The corn cooled on plates while 62 German women struggled with shame and American staff grappled with their unintentional insult. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell did not sleep that night. She sat in her small office, a cup of coffee growing cold on her desk, thinking about the disaster in the dining hall. The corn incident had undone weeks of careful progress, had confirmed every suspicion the German women held about American barbarism. She needed to fix this, but simply explaining would not be enough. She needed to show them. The next morning, Sarah called a meeting with her staff. Corporal Martinez stood with his arms crossed, still wounded by the accusation that his carefully prepared meal had been meant as mockery. Sergeant Chen leaned against the wall, thoughtful. Private Walsh fidgeted nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the tension that now permeated the camp. "We need to organize a cultural exchange," Sarah announced. "Not a lecture, a conversation. A meal where we share our foods and explain what they mean to us. Where they can do the same." She looked at Martinez directly. "James, I need you to prepare corn again. But this time, we eat together. We show them that we eat what we serve them." 3 days later, the dining hall was transformed. Tables had been arranged in a large square rather than rows, Americans and Germans sitting alternately. The kitchen staff had prepared multiple dishes featuring corn, not just corn on the cob but also cornbread, corn chowder, and succotash. Alongside these sat dishes, the German women had requested permission to prepare from their Red Cross parcels, simple foods that reminded them of home. Greta sat beside Lieutenant Mitchell, her posture still rigid but her curiosity evident. Across from her, Private Walsh sat next to Elsa, who wore his grandmother's scarf despite the warmth of the room. The atmosphere felt fragile, like glass that might shatter with one wrong word. Sarah stood, her German carefully prepared. In America, corn is sacred to many. The native people who lived here first taught the early settlers how to grow it. Without corn, many of our ancestors would have starved. It saved lives. It built this country. She paused, letting her words settle. We did not know that in Germany, you feed it only to animals. This was our ignorance, not mockery. Corporal Martinez stood next, his voice thick with emotion. My abuela, my grandmother, she makes tamales with corn for every birthday, every holiday. When she wraps the corn masa, she prays. She gives thanks. This is how we show love in my family. He picked up an ear of corn from his plate and, maintaining eye contact with the German women, took a bite. I eat what I serve you. Always. Greta watched him chew, watched the other Americans follow his example. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached for the corn on her own plate. Her hand trembled slightly. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, degrading, animal behavior. But she thought about the scarf around her neck, about Tommy's grandmother's gift to Elsa, about the ginger tea Sergeant Chen's mother had sent. She bit down. The sweetness exploded across her tongue, unexpected and overwhelming. It tasted nothing like the hard, starchy kernels she remembered from the pig feed. This was tender, almost like candy, with butter and salt creating flavors she had never imagined corn could possess. Around the table, other German women followed her lead. February brought more than snow to Camp Devens. It brought letters. The Red Cross had finally established reliable mail routes from Europe, and packets of correspondence arrived in canvas bags marked with official stamps and seals. Lieutenant Mitchell distributed them during evening roll call, watching faces transform as women recognized handwriting on envelopes or saw return addresses from towns they thought might no longer exist. Greta received 3 letters that evening. Her hands shook as she carried them back to the barracks, unable to open them in front of others, needing privacy for whatever news they contained. She sat on her bunk, the thin mattress creaking beneath her weight, and stared at the envelopes. One from her mother, dated November. One from her aunt in Cologne, dated December. One from the Red Cross itself, which filled her with immediate dread. She opened her mother's letter first. The handwriting was shaky, less precise than Greta remembered, and the paper showed water stains that might have been tears or rain. My dearest Greta, it began, I pray this letter finds you safe, wherever you are. We have had no word since September. The farm is gone. Allied bombers came in October, targeting the munitions factory 5 kilometers away, but their bombs fell wide. Our barn burned. The house is damaged beyond repair. Your father tried to save the animals, but most perished in the fire. Greta's vision blurred. She blinked hard, forcing herself to continue reading. We are living with the Schneiders in town now, 3 families sharing their small house. There is little food. Your father's heart is broken. He keeps saying he failed, that he could not protect what generations built. I tell him we are alive, that this is what matters, but I see him fading each day. Greta, I do not know if we will survive this winter. I do not know if you will ever read this, but know that we love you. Know that we understand you did what you believed was right. The letter fell from Greta's hands. She sat motionless, trying to process the information. Her home, the white farmhouse with green shutters, existed now only in the photograph she carried. The pigs her father had tended so carefully, the dairy cows her mother had milked every morning, all gone. Everything that had defined her childhood, reduced to ash and memory. Around her, similar scenes unfolded. Katrin Schultz sobbed into her pillow, having learned her entire neighborhood in Berlin had been leveled. Elsa sat very still, staring at a letter informing her that her hospital in Hamburg had been bombed, that colleagues she had worked beside for years were dead. Another woman, Maria Klein, learned her parents had been killed in an air raid. The barracks filled with the sounds of grief, raw and unrestrained. Lieutenant Mitchell entered quietly, accompanied by the camp chaplain. She moved between bunks, offering tissues, speaking softly in German, asking if anyone needed medical assistance for shock. When she reached Greta, she simply sat down beside her, saying nothing, her presence itself an offering of comfort. Greta looked at the American officer through tears. "Why?" she whispered. "Why does war destroy everything?" Sarah had no answer, only her hand on Greta's shoulder, steady and warm, a small anchor in a world that had come completely untethered. The letters from Germany changed something fundamental in the camp. The German women moved through their days with a new hollowness in their eyes, the kind that came from having nothing left to return to. Greta found herself unable to sleep, lying awake each night wondering if her parents would survive, if her brother Friedrich still lived, if anything of her former life remained intact, beyond memories and a single photograph. One morning, she approached Lieutenant Mitchell with a request. "I would like to improve my English," she said, her voice flat but determined. "If I am to understand this country, I must speak the language properly." What she did not to say was that learning gave her something to focus on besides grief, a purpose that kept her from drowning in despair. Sarah arranged for daily lessons in a small room off the main administration building. Sergeant David Chen volunteered to help, bringing textbooks and newspapers, teaching not just vocabulary but context, explaining idioms and cultural references that made no literal sense. He was patient and thoughtful, never condescending, treating Greta as an intellectual equal rather than an enemy prisoner. During their third lesson, Chen shared his own family's story. "My grandparents came from Guangdong province in 1887, he said. They faced hatred here. Signs that said no Chinese allowed. Laws that prevented them from owning property or becoming citizens. My father was born in America, but was still treated as foreign, as less than human." Greta looked up from her textbook, surprised by this revelation. "But you fight for America. You wear the uniform." "I fight for what America can be," Chen replied. "Not what it always is. My father taught me that you do not abandon something because it is imperfect. You work to make it better. The same people who once hated my family now accept us. Change is possible, but only if someone believes in it enough to stay and fight for it." His words resonated deeper than any grammar lesson could. Greta began to see parallels between Chen's family story and her own situation. She too was foreign, unwanted, viewed with suspicion. Yet here she sat, learning from someone who understood what it meant to be an outsider, who had chosen to believe in possibility rather than surrender to bitterness. The language lessons expanded organically. Other German women asked to join, and soon Chen was teaching a class of 8. In return, Greta offered to teach German to interested American staff. Lieutenant Mitchell attended, along with Private Walsh and several others. The exchanges became more than vocabulary drills. They became conversations about culture, about assumptions, about the ways language shaped understanding. Greta discovered that teaching forced her to examine her own language differently. She had to explain why German verbs worked a certain way, why certain words carried cultural weight. In doing so, she began to see how language reflected values, how the structure of communication revealed what a culture considered important. One afternoon, Walsh struggled with German word order. Greta laughed, actually laughed, for the first time since receiving her mother's letter. The sound surprised her, proof that joy still existed somewhere inside her damaged heart. Chen smiled, recognizing the significance of that small moment. Language was building a bridge where once there had been only a chasm of misunderstanding and fear. March arrived with the gradual softening of earth and the first brave crocuses pushing through the last patches of snow. The camp felt different as winter released its grip, as if the warming air carried permission to breathe more freely, to hope more openly. The German women emerged from the long dark months changed, their rigid military bearing slowly giving way to something more human, more vulnerable. Greta noticed the shift in small ways. Women who had once sat in silent, separate groups during meals now mixed more freely with American staff. Conversations that had been purely functional, requests and acknowledgments, evolved into genuine exchanges. Elsa taught Private Walsh how to darn socks properly, showing him the technique her grandmother had taught her. Katrin Schultz helped in the kitchen voluntarily, not because she was assigned but because Corporal Martinez reminded her of her uncle, and cooking alongside him eased her homesickness. The transformation was not universal or simple. Some women still maintained walls of anger and resentment, still saw their captors as enemies regardless of kindnesses shown. But enough had changed that the atmosphere in the camp felt fundamentally different from those first frozen weeks of November. Trust, fragile and tentative, had begun to take root. Lieutenant Mitchell proposed a garden. The camp had a section of unused land behind the barracks, and she suggested the women might want to plant vegetables for the coming summer. The idea met with surprising enthusiasm. For many of the German women, farming and gardening represented connection to home, to the life they had known before the war, consumed everything. Greta found herself leading the planning. She sketched layouts based on her father's farm, organizing beds for potatoes, cabbage, beans, and carrots, traditional German vegetables that grew well in similar climates. But then Martinez suggested adding a section for corn, and after a long pause, Greta nodded. "Yes," she said quietly. "We should grow corn. We should learn about corn." The work of preparing the garden brought Americans and Germans together in new ways. They dug side by side in the muddy earth, their hands equally dirty, their backs equally sore. Sergeant Chen showed them how his mother prepared soil, mixing in compost, and talking about the Chinese agricultural techniques his family had brought to America. Walsh demonstrated the Three Sisters method he had learned from a Native American farmhand in Iowa, planting corn, beans, and squash together so they supported each other's growth. As they worked, conversations flowed more naturally. The German women began asking questions about America, not defensive or accusatory questions but genuine curiosity. What were American schools like? How did elections work? Why did Americans seem so optimistic even during war? The American staff asked questions too, carefully avoiding politics but seeking to understand German culture, music, traditions that had nothing to do with Nazism or war. One afternoon, Greta paused in her digging and looked around the garden. American and German, former enemies, were laughing together over a joke Walsh had attempted in broken German. For a moment, the war felt distant, almost unreal. Here, in this muddy plot of earth, they were simply people trying to grow something good. April brought more than spring flowers, it brought photographs. Lieutenant Mitchell entered the barracks one evening carrying a folder marked with official military stamps, her face pale and drawn. She had been ordered to share certain information with the prisoners, information that had been filtering back from Europe as Allied forces advanced deeper into German territory. Information that would shatter whatever remained of the German women's understanding of their homeland. She gathered them in the common room, her hands trembling slightly as she opened the folder. "I must show you something," she said in German, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do not do this to punish you or shame you, but you have a right to know what has been discovered, what was done in your country's name." The photographs showed concentration camps, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, images of skeletal prisoners, mass graves, gas chambers disguised as showers. The German women stared in silence, their faces draining of color. Some turned away, unable to look. Others leaned closer, as if proximity might reveal these images as forgeries, as enemy propaganda designed to demoralize them. Greta felt her world tilting. She looked at photograph after photograph, each one more horrific than the last. Children behind barbed wire, their eyes hollow and ancient. Bodies stacked like cordwood. Survivors who barely seemed human, so emaciated that bones pressed against translucent skin. "No," she whispered, "this cannot be real. This is not Germany. We are not monsters." But Lieutenant Mitchell had brought more than photographs. She had testimony from German guards who had been captured, confessions from camp administrators, detailed records kept by the SS with bureaucratic precision. The toxin-trapped evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. This had happened. This was happening still, as Allied forces liberated camp after camp, discovering the full extent of the horror. Elsa vomited into a waste bin, her body rejecting what her mind could not process. Katrin began to scream, a high keening sound that seemed to come from somewhere beyond reason. Other women simply wept, or sat in shocked silence, or frantically insisted this must be lies, propaganda, impossible. "We served Germany," Maria Klein said, her voice breaking. "We believed we were defending our country. How could this be what we were defending?" Greta thought about her parents, living with the Schneiders in their bombed-out town. Had they known? Had her father, who treated his animals with such gentleness, suspected what was happening just beyond his fields? Had her mother, who taught Greta to be kind to everyone, looked away when Jewish neighbors disappeared? The questions felt like acid in her mind. That night, the barracks fell into a silence unlike any before. Women lay in their bunks, staring at ceilings, wrestling with guilt and disbelief, and the terrible realization that the enemy they had been taught to hate had liberated people from unimaginable suffering. That perhaps the real enemy had been wearing the same uniform they had once worn with pride. Greta clutched her photograph of the farm, but it no longer represented home. It represented complicity, ignorance, a world built on lies she had never thought to question. The days following the revelation moved like wading through deep water. The German women struggled to reconcile the country they had loved with the atrocities committed in its name. Some withdrew completely, refusing to speak or eat. Others directed their anguish inward, consumed by guilt for not knowing, for not questioning, for serving a regime that had perpetrated such evil. The camp chaplain worked overtime, counseling women on the edge of despair. Greta found herself walking to the garden plot early one morning before roll call. The earth they had prepared weeks ago sat waiting for seeds, dark and fertile, promising nothing, yet holding infinite possibility. She knelt in the dirt, her hands sinking into the cool soil, and felt something shift inside her chest. They could not undo the past. They could not bring back the dead or erase the photographs burned into their memories. But perhaps they could grow something new. She found Lieutenant Mitchell in the administration building. "The garden," Greta said, her voice hoarse from crying, "I want to expand it, make it bigger. I want to grow food, real food, enough to share. I cannot fix what Germany did, but I can do this. I can grow something good from this soil." Sarah understood immediately. This was not about vegetables. This was about redemption, about creating life in the shadow of so much death. "How much bigger?" she asked. Greta spread her arms wide. "As big as you will allow. I want every woman who can work to have a place in this garden. I want us to plant seeds and tend them and watch things grow. I want to remember what it means to nurture instead of destroy." Within days, the garden project transformed. The small plot expanded to cover nearly an acre. American staff brought seeds donated by local farmers. The German women worked from dawn until dusk, channeling their grief and guilt into physical labor that left them exhausted but somehow cleaner. They planted rows of potatoes and carrots, beds of lettuce and cabbage, trellises for beans to climb, and corn. They planted corn. Greta insisted on it, selecting the seeds herself from the varieties Martinez offered. "We will grow it," she told the other women. "We will tend it. We will learn to see it not as animal feed but as the Americans do, as sustenance and celebration. We will learn to see many things differently." The work became communal in ways nothing else had. American and German women labored side by side, their conversations moving beyond surface pleasantries into deeper territory. They talked about guilt and responsibility, about how ordinary people became complicit in extraordinary evil. They discussed what it meant to love a country that had done unspeakable things, whether patriotism could survive the death of innocents. Sergeant Chen worked alongside Greta one afternoon, both of them thinning carrot seedlings. "My grandfather used to say that a garden is an act of faith," he told her. "You put seeds in the ground believing they will grow, believing the future will come, even when the present is dark." Greta nodded. understanding that this garden had become their collective act of faith, their declaration that growth was still possible even for those complicit in a nation's sins. May 8, 1945, dawned clear and bright, the kind of spring morning that seemed designed for new beginnings. The German women woke to the sound of church bells ringing in Worcester, carried on the wind across the fields to the camp. They looked at each other with confusion and growing dread, understanding that bells ringing on such a scale could mean only one thing. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered. Lieutenant Mitchell gathered them in the common room at 10 o'clock. Her face showed relief mixed with something more complicated, an emotion the women could not quite identify. She stood before them, 62 women who had become more than prisoners over the past 6 months, and took a deep breath before speaking in careful German. "The war is over," she said simply. "Germany has surrendered unconditionally. The Third Reich no longer exists." She paused, letting the words settle like stones in still water. Around the room, women absorbed the news in silence. Some had expected this for months. Others still looked shocked, as if they had believed until this moment that somehow Germany might prevail. Sarah continued, her voice gentle but firm. "Under the terms of the Geneva Convention, you are now eligible for repatriation. Ships are being prepared to return prisoners of war to Europe. Within the next few weeks, you will be transported to Boston, and from there to Germany." She looked around the room, meeting eyes that suddenly showed not relief, but fear. "You are going home." But the word home hung in the air, like a question rather than a statement. Greta thought about her parents living in someone else's house, her family farm reduced to rubble. She thought about the photographs of concentration camps, about returning to a country that would forever bear the stain of what it had done. She thought about the garden outside, about corn growing in neat rows, about English lessons with Sergeant Chen, about the way Lieutenant Mitchell had sat beside her when the letters came, offering comfort without words. Around her, other women were having similar thoughts. Elsa stared at her hands, still wearing the ring her grandmother had given her, wondering what Hamburg looked like now, whether her hospital still stood, whether she could bear to walk streets where neighbors had been dragged away while people like her did nothing. Katrine thought about Berlin, about rubble and starvation, and the long, hard years of rebuilding that lay ahead. Lieutenant Mitchell seemed to sense their turmoil. "If any of you wish to discuss your options privately," she said quietly, "my office is available. I know this news is complicated. Take time to think about what you want." She turned to leave, then paused. "For what it is worth, it has been an honor to know you. All of you. Whatever you decide, I hope you find peace." That afternoon, Greta knocked on Lieutenant Mitchell's office door. Behind her stood Elsa, Katrine, and 14 other women. Their faces showed determination mixed with fear, the expressions of people about to make a choice that would define the rest of their lives. "Lieutenant," Greta said in her now fluent English, "we need to talk about staying." Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell looked at the 17 women crowding into her small office with surprise and something like wonder. She had suspected some might want to remain in America, but she had not expected so many, had not anticipated the determination she saw in their faces. "Please," she said, gesturing to the chairs and the floor, where some would need to sit. "Tell me what you are thinking." Greta spoke first, her role as unofficial leader having solidified over the months. "Lieutenant, we have discussed this among ourselves. We do not wish to return to Germany." She paused, choosing her words carefully in English that had become remarkably fluent. "Some of us have no homes to return to. The war destroyed our cities, our families. But this is not the only reason." She looked at the other women, drawing strength from their nods of encouragement. "We have learned things here, about ourselves, about what we served. We cannot unknow what the photographs showed us. We cannot return to Germany and pretend we are innocent. But we also cannot face that guilt alone, surrounded by others who will deny or minimize what happened." Her voice grew stronger. "Here, in America, we have seen something different. We have been treated as human beings even when we were enemies. We have been shown that change is possible. Elsa leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I was a nurse. I took an oath to heal, to do no harm. I cannot return to a country where the medical profession participated in murder, where doctors selected who would live and die in those camps. But here, I can practice medicine in a way that honors what the profession should be. I want to heal people, to make amends through my work. Katrin, the youngest of the group at 19, spoke quietly. I have nothing in Berlin. My family is dead. My neighborhood is rubble. But here, Corporal Martinez says I have a gift for cooking. He says he can help me find work in a restaurant that I can build a life. I want that chance. I want to become someone other than what Germany made me. One by one, the other women shared their reasons. Some spoke of destroyed homes and lost families. Others talked about the shame of returning to a defeated nation, of facing neighbors who would forever see them as part of the regime. But most spoke about what they had discovered in captivity, about kindness from enemies, about the possibility of redemption, about corn that tasted sweet instead of bitter. Sarah listened to each woman, taking notes, her heart heavy with the weight of their trust. This is not a simple process, she warned them. There are laws, regulations, immigration procedures. You may face prejudice and suspicion. America is not perfect. You will encounter people who hate you simply for being German. We know, Greta said simply. But we also know what you and Sergeant Chen and Private Walsh have shown us, that some Americans can see past hatred. That is enough. That is more than Germany ever showed to those it deemed different. She met Sarah's eyes directly. We are asking for a chance, nothing more. A chance to prove we can be better than what we were. The camp divided not along lines of hostility but of heartbreak. The 45 women who had chosen repatriation understood the decision of those staying, even supported it. But the approaching separation felt like another loss in a war that had already taken too much. Friendships formed in captivity, bonds created through shared trauma and slow healing, would soon be severed by an ocean and diverging choices about what home meant. Greta found herself sitting with Maria Klein one evening in the garden they had built together. Maria had decided to return to Germany. Her parents were alive, elderly and struggling in Cologne, and she could not abandon them regardless of how difficult life there would be. I do not judge your choice, Maria said quietly, her fingers trailing over a tomato plant heavy with green fruit. I understand it. I even envy it. But my mother is 72 years old, living in a city that no longer exists. I have to go back. I know, Greta replied, her throat tight with unshed tears. If my parents needed me, I would return too. But they wrote in the last letter, told me to build a life wherever I am, that they do not want me to sacrifice my future for their past. She had memorized those words, her mother's careful script releasing her from obligation even as it broke both their hearts. Throughout the camp, similar conversations unfolded. Women who had shared bunks for months, who had cried together over letters from home and revelations about concentration camps, who had planted seeds side by side in the spring mud, now faced goodbye. They exchanged addresses, though everyone knew the chaos of post-war Germany made mail delivery uncertain. They made promises to write, to remember, to somehow stay connected across the Atlantic. Elsa stood before her bunk, packing the few possessions she had accumulated. Private Walsh's grandmother's scarf lay folded carefully at the top of her bag. She would take it back to Hamburg, a reminder that even enemies could show unexpected kindness. Anna Fisher, her bunkmate and friend, was staying in America. They had shared everything for 6 months, their fears and hopes and gradual transformations, and now circumstance was tearing them apart. Promise me, you will find happiness, Anna said, embracing Elsa tightly. Promise me you will not let guilt consume you. What happened was not your fault. You were young, following orders, believing lies we were all told. Promise me the same, Elsa whispered back. Promise me, America will be kind to you, that you will find the peace we both need. They held each other, two women who had been enemies of America, who had become friends in captivity, now choosing different paths toward uncertain futures. The evening before the first group departed, Lieutenant Mitchell organized a farewell dinner. Americans and Germans sat together one last time, sharing food that now included both corn on the cob and German potato salad, a meal that represented the bridge they had built. Sergeant Chen offered a toast in both English and German. "To courage," he said, "the courage to change, to forgive, to hope. Whether you return to Germany or remain here, may you find what you seek." Tears flowed freely. These were not tears of defeat but of transformation, of painful growth, of recognition that sometimes love means letting go. The transition from prisoner to immigrant was neither smooth nor simple. Greta and the 16 other women who remained faced months of legal processing, interviews with immigration officials who viewed them with suspicion, and the challenge of finding sponsors willing to vouch for former enemy nationals. Lieutenant Mitchell worked tirelessly on their behalf, calling in favors, writing letters of recommendation, testifying to their character and their genuine desire to contribute to American society. By August of 1945, Greta found herself standing on a farm in central Massachusetts, 40 miles from the camp that had been her home for 9 months. The farmer, Robert Henderson, was a widower in his 50s, whose 3 sons had served in the war. 2 had returned, 1 had not. He needed help with the harvest and had agreed, after lengthy conversations with Lieutenant Mitchell, to give Greta a chance. "I won't lie to you," Henderson said on her first day, his weathered face stern but not unkind. "My boy died fighting Germans in France. Taking you on, it sticks in my throat some. But Sarah Mitchell says you're good people, and I trust her judgment. You work hard, you treat this land with respect, you'll have a place here." Greta worked harder than she had ever worked in her life. She rose before dawn to help with milking, spent days in fields harvesting vegetables, learned American farming techniques while sharing methods her father had taught her. Henderson watched her carefully at first, looking for signs of laziness or entitlement, but found only dedication and genuine skill. His initial coldness gradually thawed into grudging respect. The community's response was mixed. Some neighbors refused to speak to her, viewing her presence as an insult to those who had died fighting Germany. Others, seeing her dedication and hearing her story from Henderson, cautiously accepted her. The local Lutheran church became her refuge, the pastor having spent time in Germany before the war and understanding the complex reality of ordinary Germans caught in extraordinary evil. Katrin found work in a restaurant in Boston, where Corporal Martinez's cousin owned an Italian eatery. She learned to make pasta and pizza, her German precision translating well to the demands of a professional kitchen. Anna Fisher, who had also chosen to stay, completed her nursing certification and began working at Worcester General Hospital. Her patient care was exemplary, her gentleness born from deep understanding of suffering. The other women scattered across Massachusetts and neighboring states, finding work as seamstresses, teachers, domestic helpers, and factory workers. They faced prejudice and suspicion, but they also found unexpected kindness. Americans who looked past their accents and histories, who gave them chances to prove themselves, who recognized that the capacity for change existed in individuals, even when nations failed. Greta stood in Henderson's cornfield one September afternoon, surrounded by stalks taller than her head, golden tassels waving in the breeze. She ran her hand along an ear of corn, feeling the silk, remembering the disgust she had felt 9 months earlier. Now this plant represented something else entirely. It represented her transformation from prisoner to farmer, from German to something new. She pulled an ear from its stalk and bit into the raw kernels, sweet and milky and tasting like home. 20 years passed like water flowing over stones, slowly wearing away sharp edges until what remained was smooth and shaped by time. Greta Hoffman Henderson stood in the large kitchen of the farmhouse that had become hers after Robert Henderson's death 5 years earlier. He had left her the farm in his will, stating simply that she had earned it through dedication, love of the land, and the kind of integrity his own son would have respected. She was preparing for the annual German-American Friendship Dinner, an event she had started 10 years ago in the church basement. What had begun as a small gathering of the 17 women who had stayed, sharing their stories with curious locals, had grown into a community tradition that drew people from across the county. Tonight, Over 200 people would gather to celebrate the bridge between two cultures, to remember that even the deepest wounds could heal, given time and genuine effort. Greta moved around her kitchen with practiced efficiency, preparing both German and American dishes. Potato salad made from her mother's recipe, now modified with American mayonnaise that she had learned to prefer. Apple strudel that reminded her of childhood, served alongside apple pie that represented her adopted country. And corn, always corn, prepared a dozen different ways because it had become her symbol of transformation, her personal reminder of the night she had first tasted sweetness where she expected bitterness. Her daughter, Sarah, named for Lieutenant Mitchell, helped arrange ears of corn on serving platters. At 15 years old, she moved between German and English effortlessly, embodying the blending of cultures that Greta had lived. Sarah knew her mother's story, had heard it countless times, understood that she existed because her mother had chosen courage over comfort, transformation over return to the familiar. The guests began, arriving at dusk. Elsa came from Worcester with her nursing colleagues, still unmarried, but radiantly content with a life devoted to healing. Katrin arrived from Boston with her husband, an Italian-American chef she had met at the restaurant where Corporal Martinez had helped her find work. Anna Fisher brought her 3 children, proof that former enemies could build families in the soil of reconciliation. Lieutenant Mitchell, now retired from military service and working as a social worker in Boston, arrived with Sergeant Chen and his wife. Private Walsh sent his regrets from Iowa, but had mailed a box of his grandmother's hand-knitted scarves for Greta to distribute to newcomers who might need warmth and welcome. The connections forged in captivity had endured across decades, had grown into something resembling family. As dinner began, Greta stood to speak, holding up an ear of perfectly grilled corn. 20 years ago, she said in English, still touched by a German accent, I looked at corn and saw pig food, saw humiliation, saw everything that divided me from Americans. Tonight, I see sustenance, celebration, and the miracle of transformed understanding. She paused, looking around at faces both German and American. We cannot change our pasts, but we can choose what we plant in the soil of our futures. This corn represents not what separated us, but what brought us together. The room erupted in applause, and Greta smiled, finally at peace with both her past and her present.